Emily Carter pressed her mother's hand against her cheek and felt nothing but cold. Not the cold of mourning, the cold of goodbye dressed up as love. "It's the only way," her mother whispered. "Forgive me." Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. Because some betrayals don't come from enemies. They come wrapped in a mother's apology handed over at dawn before anyone else wakes up to witness the shame. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon didn't slow when it hit the ruts in the Montana road. It jolted hard, rattling Emily's teeth, bouncing her off the wooden bench seat twice before she grabbed the side rail and held on. She kept her eyes forward. Not because there was anything worth watching ahead, just because she refused to look back at the town she was leaving. Refused to look back at the porch where her mother stood, one hand raised in something that was supposed to be a wave, but looked more like a drowning gesture. She was 22 years old. She had never been more than 30 miles from Millhaven. She had never ridden alone in a wagon with a man she didn't know. She had never been sold. But here she was. The driver, a weathered ranch hand named Pete, who smelled of tobacco and old leather, hadn't said more than 4 words since they left town. He didn't seem to feel any need to add more. He just clicked his tongue at the horses and kept the reins loose and drove like this was any ordinary morning errand. Maybe for him it was. Emily clutched the small cloth bag on her lap. Inside one spare dress, a tin of sewing needles, a photograph of her younger brother Thomas, taken 2 summers ago when he was still well enough to smile for it, and a letter from her mother she hadn't been able to open yet. The bag was light. She had packed everything that mattered, and it barely weighed anything at all. That felt like a verdict on her whole life. She thought about Thomas, 8 years old and already carrying the sound of wet lungs when he breathed. The doctor in Millhaven had told her mother it would take money they didn't have, and medicine that didn't come cheap, and rest in a place better than a 2-room house with a leaking roof. Her mother had nodded at everything the doctor said, thanked him quietly, and then walked home without speaking. 3 days later, she told Emily about Jacob Whitaker. "He needs a wife," her mother had said, not asked, said. "His housekeeper left. His ranch is falling behind. He's offering payment, real payment, Emily, enough to get Thomas through the winter and into spring treatment." Emily had stood very still at the kitchen table. "He's offering payment. For a wife. For someone to run his household. For me." Her mother had looked away. And that look, that single turn of the head, that refusal to meet her daughter's eyes, had told Emily everything she needed to know about how her mother had already decided this conversation would end. "How old is he?" Emily had asked, because she needed to ask something practical or she would scream. 35. "What happened to him?" A pause. "He had an accident. In the mountains. A grizzly attack, they say. He walks with a cane now. He lives alone, has for 2 years. People in town say he's—" Her mother stopped. "Say he's what?" "Difficult." Emily had laughed. Not a funny laugh. The kind that comes out when there's nothing else left. "Difficult." "He's not cruel," her mother said quickly, and Emily noticed she didn't say he was kind. So now here, Emily sat in Pete's wagon, rattling up into the foothills of the Montana mountains, with her whole life in a cloth bag, and the word difficult echoing in her skull. The ranch appeared without warning around a long bend in the trail, not because it was hidden, but because Emily had stopped looking. She almost missed it. Pete pulled back on the reins, and the horses slowed, and she looked up, and there it was. Whitaker Ranch. Spread wide along the base of a granite ridge, a main house solid and square, and Sirius a barn, larger than anything in Millhaven. 3 smaller outbuildings, split-rail fences, running longer than she could follow with her eyes. It was bigger than she expected. That surprised her. She didn't know why it should. She hadn't let herself picture anything, but it surprised her. "This is it," Pete said, which was unnecessary, but apparently the most he could offer. Emily stepped down from the wagon before he could help her. Her boots hit the dirt, and she straightened her skirt and lifted her chin because she had made a private decision somewhere on the road between Millhaven and here, whatever she felt. Whatever happened, she would not let anyone watch her crumble. She would not give anyone that. She heard him before she saw him. the sound of a cane striking hard-packed earth. Deliberate, slow, measured. Jacob Whittaker came around the corner of the main house and stopped. He was taller than she expected, and she hadn't expected anything which made the height matter less than the way he held it. Like a man who had once been larger than himself and was still figuring out what remained. He wore a dark shirt, work-worn at the elbows, canvas trousers, boots that had been good once, and still were in the places that counted. His hat was pushed back slightly on his head. He held the cane in his right hand, not leaning on it heavily, but not ignoring it either. Just using it the way you use something you've made your peace with. His face was hard, not mean hard. Mountain hard. The kind of face that had been weathered into angles by years at elevation where the wind doesn't apologize and the sun doesn't negotiate. He looked at her. She looked at him. Pete climbed down from the wagon and started untying her bag from the back, and nobody said anything for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then Jacob Whittaker said, "You're younger than I thought." Emily kept her chin level. "You're quieter than I expected." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not quite, but it wasn't what she'd braced for either. He looked at Pete. "Take the wagon around back. Feed the horses." Pete nodded and moved off with the efficiency of a man who understood that his job was finished and his presence was no longer useful. That left Emily and Jacob standing 10 feet apart in the summer dust, with everything unspoken between them. "Come inside," Jacob said. He turned and started back toward the house and didn't wait to see if she followed. She followed, because what else was there? The inside of the house was clean. That surprised her again. She had built a picture in her head of chaos dishes. Unwashed floors unswept the physical evidence of a man who had stopped caring for his surroundings, the way people said he had stopped caring about people. But the main room was orderly, spare. The furniture was heavy and dark, and placed with no thought to comfort just function, but everything was in its place, and the floor had been swept recently. He moved to the table and stood by it, one hand on the back of a chair. He didn't pull it out for her. "Sit down," he said. She sat, but she didn't fold her hands in her lap like someone grateful. She set them flat on the table and looked at him directly. He lowered himself into the opposite chair, and she saw then the particular way he managed it. The cane, first. The left hand gripping the table edge, the controlled drop. A practiced sequence. Something he'd done 10,000 times and never stopped hating. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said, "because I find that wastes less of everybody's time." "I appreciate straight," Emily said. "This arrangement." He stopped, started again. "What your mother agreed to, what was offered. It's a business arrangement. I need someone to manage the household. Cook keep the house, oversee the supply orders. My last housekeeper left in the spring. I've managed since then, but it takes time away from the ranch work, and the ranch work doesn't stop." Emily listened to every word. She also noticed every word he didn't say. "You're not calling it a marriage," she said. "It is a marriage, legally. I'm not in the habit of lying about what things are." He met her eyes for the first time directly. His eyes were gray, not soft gray, the gray of granite after rain. "But it's not. I'm not offering you something it isn't. You'll have your own room, your own space. I'll provide for you. Thomas will receive the payment we agreed. That's the arrangement." Emily nodded slowly. "And what do you expect from me in return? Beyond the household?" "Nothing," he said. And the way he said it, flat absolute, no negotiation underneath it, told her that this wasn't cruelty. It was a man who had built very specific walls and had no intention of dismantling them for anyone. "All right," she said. He blinked, like he'd expected more resistance, like he'd prepared for argument and she'd just declined to provide it. "All right, I understood the arrangement before I came, Mr. Whittaker. I'm not confused about what this is." She kept her voice steady. "I'm here because my brother is sick, and this was the only option that saves him. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and I don't expect you to pretend either. You need your house managed. I need Thomas to survive the winter. We both understand what we're doing." Something crossed his face too quick for her to name it. Respect, maybe. or something close enough to it that it wore the same expression. "Jacob," he said. "Excuse me. You can call me Jacob. Mr. Whitaker was my father." "Emily," she said. He nodded. Stood the same careful sequence in reverse. "I'll show you your room." Her room was at the end of the east hallway, separated from the rest of the house by 2 closed doors. It was small, a single bed with a wool blanket, a washstand, 1 window facing the ridge, a hook on the back of the door for her clothes. She set her bag on the bed and stood in the middle of the room and let herself breathe for 30 seconds. 30 seconds was all she allowed. Then she opened the bag, took out Thomas's photograph, and set it on the windowsill where she could see it from the bed. There. A reason. She always needed to be able to see the reason. She heard Jacob's cane on the floorboards moving away down the hall, then the heavy sound of the back door opening and closing. She went to the window and watched him move across the yard toward the barn. She noticed again the way he walked, that deliberate, careful gait, the cane doing real work on his right side, the slight list to the left. Pain in every step that he refused to let change his pace. She thought, that is a man who is furious at his own body. She also thought, I know something about that. Dinner that evening was a study in silence, so complete it almost had a sound of its own. Emily had found the kitchen, found the stores, and made a simple meal. Beans, salt pork, cornbread. Nothing elaborate. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She put the food on the table and sat down and waited. Jacob came in from the yard, washed his hands at the basin, sat down across from her. He looked at the food. He looked at her. Then he served himself and started eating. She served herself and started eating. Nobody spoke. The window above the kitchen basin let in the last of the evening light, and the sound of the ranch hands moving around the yard outside, voices occasionally the scrape of boots, the distant low of a cow. Inside silence and the clink of spoons. Finally, Emily said, "How many ranch hands do you have?" Jacob looked up, like the question had arrived from a direction he wasn't watching. 6 full-time, 2 seasonal. Do they eat here or separately? Separately, bunkhouse. She nodded. I'll need to understand the supply situation, what you're running low on, what your arrangement is with the store in town. He set his spoon down. You can wait until tomorrow for that. I'd rather start tonight. I can look over whatever you have ledgers lists after dinner if you have them. He studied her for a moment. You know how to read a ledger. My father kept the accounts for his shop before he died. I helped him from the time I was 12. Jacob seemed to recalibrate something about her. She could see it happening, some assumption being revised, some box she'd been placed in, being quietly reconsidered. I'll get the ledger after dinner, he said. Thank you. Silence again, but a slightly different silence, one that had edges filed down just barely. Then one of the ranch hands, a young man, maybe 19, with a freckled face, and the confidence of someone who didn't yet know enough to be cautious, knocked at the back door and leaned in. He looked at Emily with the wide-eyed, unguarded curiosity of the young and said, Evening, ma'am. You the new... He paused, apparently unsure what word to use. Housekeeper, Emily said. Yes, ma'am. He didn't look entirely convinced by the word, but accepted it. Jake, sorry, Mr. Whitaker, the north fence has a post gone again. Cole says it'll need fixing before morning or we'll lose the horses. Jacob was already pushing back from the table. Tell Cole I'll be out in 10 minutes. The young man, she'd later learn his name was Danny. Glanced between Jacob and Emily once more, with an expression of barely concealed fascination, then disappeared back into the evening. Emily watched Jacob prepare to rise, watched him calculate the angle to the table, the placement of the cane. She said nothing. She had already understood in some bone-deep way that offering help was the wrong thing, that it would land wrong, that this man would accept the cane before he accepted a hand. He got up and was halfway to the door when he stopped. Without turning around, he said, The beans were good. He went out. Emily sat alone at the table in the cooling kitchen and looked at Thomas's photograph in her mind and thought, one day at a time. That's all. Just one day. She couldn't sleep. She lay on the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into night, the horses shifting in the barn, the distant bark of a dog, the wind coming down off the granite ridge in long waves that moved through the grass like something breathing. These were not Millhaven sounds. In Millhaven, she'd fallen asleep to the sound of a clock in the front room, and her mother's cough, and Thomas's labored breathing from behind the thin wall. This was quieter. This was so quiet it was almost loud. She got up and went to the window and looked out at the yard. Jacob was still out there. She could see him at the fence line, a lantern on the post coal, and another hand working with tools, Jacob standing to the side. He wasn't working the fence. He couldn't not with the cane, not in the dark on uneven ground. But he was there, standing in the lantern light while his men worked present for it, overseeing, without speaking much, just there. Emily watched for a few minutes she didn't intend to watch for. She thought about what Danny had walked in on at dinner, the way he'd corrected himself searching for the right word. The new. He hadn't known what she was either. Nobody was sure what to call her, what box she fit in, what her presence here meant about Jacob Whittaker and his life going forward. She didn't know either. She went back to bed. Morning came hard and early. Emily was in the kitchen before anyone else, because that was who she'd always been, the first one up, the one who made things run so other people could function. She had the fire going and water on, and was working through the flower stores when she heard the cane in the hallway. Jacob appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her already at work, the kitchen already functional. He looked at the fire, at the pot on the stove. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please." She poured. He took the cup. He didn't sit, just stood at the kitchen doorway with the cup and looked out the back window toward the barn where the morning hands were beginning to move. "I looked at the ledger last night," Emily said, "after you went out." He turned slightly. "And you're low on flour and salt. Your coffee supply will last maybe 2 more weeks. You've got good stores of beans and corn, but almost no preserves, no fruits, no jams. If you've got men working here through winter, you'll need more than beans." He drank his coffee and said nothing, which she'd already started to recognize meant continue. "The ledger also shows you paid the Millhaven supply store twice for the same order in March. Once in February's records and once in April. Someone made an error or you were overcharged." Jacob went very still. "Show me." She showed him. They stood side by side at the kitchen table with the ledger between them, him with his coffee, her with her finger tracing the column, and for the first time there was something in the space between them that wasn't tension or silence, or the weight of the strange arrangement they were both living inside. It was just 2 people looking at a problem together. "I'll write to Henderson at the store," Jacob said. "I can write it if you'd like. I can have it ready before Pete goes to town." He looked at her sideways, like he was doing a calculation about her that he hadn't finished yet. "All right," he said. She started to turn back to the stove. He said without particular emotion, "You're more capable than I was told." Emily stopped. "What were you told?" A pause. "That you were a seamstress's daughter." "I am," she said. "But my father kept those books for 12 years, and I kept them for 4 after he died. A needle and thread doesn't make you simple, Mr. Whittaker." "Jacob," he said, for the second time, like he'd already forgotten she'd accepted it and needed to offer it again. "Jacob," she said. He nodded, took his coffee, and went out. By the end of the first week, Emily had reorganized the kitchen stores, written 3 letters for Jacob, one to the supply store, one to a lawyer in Helena, about a land boundary question Jacob had mentioned in passing at dinner, one to a livestock dealer about spring purchasing, identified a roof leak over the east storage room, and informed Jacob and learned the names of all 6 full-time ranch hands. Danny was the youngest. He had a habit of appearing in doorways at inopportune moments and asking questions that weren't quite impolite, but definitely weren't cautious. On Thursday afternoon, he appeared at the kitchen door while she was mending a work shirt she'd found abandoned on the kitchen chair. "Ma'am," he said. "Danny. Can I ask you something? You're going to regardless." He grinned. "How come you never talked to Mr. Whitaker at dinner? I mean, I heard you talk that first night. And I know you write his letters, but every time I see you two at the same time, you're just not talking." Emily kept her eyes on the needle. "Because there isn't always something that needs saying. My ma always said silence between married people is a bad sign. Then it's a good thing your mother isn't here to make assumptions about what she's observing." She looked up at him, not unkind, just clear. "Is there something you needed, Danny?" He had the good grace to look slightly abashed. "No, ma'am, just—" He stopped. "He was different before is all. Before the accident. He used to laugh. Just used to be a different person." He said it like it mattered, like he thought it might be useful information. Then he turned and went back out before she could respond. Emily sat with the mended shirt in her hands and thought about a man who used to laugh. That evening at dinner, Jacob set down his fork after a few minutes and said without preamble, "The lawyer in Helena wrote back." Emily looked up. "The boundary question I mentioned. Turns out I was right. The Crenshaws have been grazing their cattle on my South 40 for 2 seasons and claiming it as their land in the county record. Henderson, the county assessor, appears to have made some errors in the registered description." The word errors came out with a particular flatness that suggested he didn't believe they were errors. "What are you going to do?" "Contest it, properly, through the court." He picked up his fork again. "The lawyer wants documentation. Historical records of the boundary. I have some of it, but I'll need to go through my father's papers." "I can help with that," Emily said. "Going through records. Organizing them." He looked at her across the table. In the evening light, the granite gray of his eyes was almost dark. "You've done enough already this week." "I've done what needed doing." "Yes." A pause. "That's what I said." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then looked back at her plate. After dinner, she was washing the dishes when she heard a sound from the yard low and sharp that wasn't right. She dried her hands and went to the back door and looked out. Jacob was at the foot of the porch steps. He'd come down wrong. She could see it in the way he was standing. Cane forward. Weight wrong, one hand on the porch post. He hadn't fallen. Not quite. But he'd come very close, and he was standing still in the aftermath of it, breathing carefully. The particular stillness of a man who is furious at himself and has nowhere to put the fury. Emily stayed in the doorway. She didn't go to him. She didn't call out. She just waited. After a long moment, Jacob got his feet right and kept walking toward the barn. She went back inside. She stood at the sink and gripped the edge of it for a moment. He was different before Danny had said. Before the accident. He used to laugh. She thought about that, about a man who had once been a legend in these mountains, who had tracked grizzlies and survived elevation that broke other men who had known every ridge and canyon pass by, name reduced to negotiating 3 porch steps in the dark with his own rage for company. She thought losing your body isn't the same as losing yourself. But nobody around him seems to have told him that. She finished the dishes. She didn't say anything to him that night, but she left the porch lantern burning when she went to bed. In the morning, she found that someone had filled the wood box by the kitchen door, stacked neat and full to the top, more wood than she'd need for a week. There was no note. There was no mention of it at breakfast. But Jacob Whitaker sat down at the kitchen table that morning and said unprompted, "Danny tells me you mended his work shirt." "It was abandoned on my kitchen chair. He loses things. Don't let him make a habit of it." "I won't," Emily said. "Also." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "The beans last night. The seasoning was different. I added sage, from what's growing near the east fence. It was better." She kept her face neutral. "I'll remember that." He nodded, drank his coffee, looked out the window, and somewhere in that ordinary exchange in the sage and the wood box and the lantern left burning, The first hairline fracture appeared in the wall that Jacob Whittaker had spent 2 years building around whatever was left of himself. Neither of them named it. But Emily felt it, and she was careful, very careful, not to push on it. Not yet. The wood box stayed full every morning after that. Emily never asked who filled it. Jacob never mentioned it. That was how things worked between them now, small gestures that neither of them was ready to name, passing back and forth across the silence, like notes slipped under a door. 2 weeks into her time at Whittaker Ranch, Emily had settled into a rhythm. Up before dawn, fire started water on breakfast ready when the hands came in from early chores. Ledger work in the late morning. Mending supply organization correspondence in the afternoon. Dinner on the table by 6. She had stopped waiting for Jacob to acknowledge the work she did. She had started doing it because it needed doing, and that was enough. But she noticed things. She couldn't help it. She noticed that Jacob always came back from the South Fields around 2 in the afternoon and went directly to the study instead of the barn. She noticed that he never sat in the main room in the evenings, always the study door half open, lamplight until late. She noticed that Danny and the other hands never knocked on the study door, that there was an unspoken rule about that half-open door that everyone observed and nobody had written down. She noticed that he ate everything she put in front of him, but never complimented it directly. Instead, he would say things like, "The hands said the cornbread yesterday was the best they'd had," or Cole asked if there was more of that soup. His praise arrived from other directions, deflected through other people, as if a straight line between himself and something good was more than he could manage. On a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks in, Emily was at the kitchen table going through the latest supply list when Danny appeared, because Danny always appeared like a young dog who had decided she was interesting, and dropped into the chair across from her without being invited. "Mr. Whittaker's in a mood," he announced. Emily kept her eyes on the list. "When isn't he?" "No, I mean a real mood. Cole said something this morning about the South Boundary situation, about maybe settling with the Crenshaws instead of fighting it, and Mr. Whittaker didn't say anything. Just walked away. Cole said, that's worse than when he yells." "Does he yell often?" "Not anymore." Danny picked up a spare pencil from the table and turned it over in his fingers. Before the accident, he'd get loud sometimes, but it was the kind of loud that made you want to work harder. Now he just gets quiet. And the quiet is... He made a face. "It's heavy." Emily set the list down. "Danny, why are you telling me this?" He looked at her with the forthright bafflement of the very young. "Because you talk to him, more than anyone else does. I write his letters and report on supply levels." "Yeah, but you look at him different than we do. We all kind of look at him like we're waiting for something to break. You look at him like you're waiting for something to open." Emily picked the list back up. "Go find something to do." But she thought about it for the rest of the morning. She thought about it while she was kneading bread dough. She thought about it while she was counting the salt stores and marking what needed ordering. She was still thinking about it when Jacob appeared in the kitchen doorway at 11:30, an unusual time. Not his pattern, and stopped when he saw her. "I need to go over the county records tonight," he said. "The ones from my father's files. I've been putting it off and I can't anymore. The lawyer wants them by end of the month." Emily turned from the counter. "I can help with that." "They're not organized. It'll take time." "I know." He looked at her for a moment. Something behind his eyes that she'd seen before, that calculation, that slow reweighing of information. "After dinner, then." "After dinner," she agreed. He nodded and turned to go. Then stopped. "Cole thinks I should settle with the Crenshaws." She kept her voice even. "What do you think?" "I think they've been stealing from me for 2 years, and settling tells them that stealing works." He said it without heat, which made it more absolute than anger would have. "I think my father surveyed that land in 1861, and the record exists, and the Crenshaws know it exists, and Henderson knows it exists, and everyone involved is betting, I'll roll over because it's easier to let a cripple lose than go up against him in court." The word cripple landed flat and deliberate. He'd put it there on purpose, she realized. Testing something. She met his eyes. "Then prove them wrong." A beat of silence. "That's what I intend," he said, and left. Emily stood in the kitchen, with her hands still in the bread dough, and thought, there it is. There's the man underneath the wall. She was careful not to let herself feel too much about it. She failed slightly, but only slightly. That night, they sat on opposite sides of the big desk in the study, with a box of old papers between them, and the lamp turned up as high as it would go. Jacob's father had been a careful man. Emily could see that in the handwriting, the dated corners, the way documents were grouped. But he had not been an organized man, and 20 years of careful chaos filled the box. Emily developed a system within the first 15-minute survey records to the left, correspondence to the right. Anything with a government seal into a separate pile for review. Jacob watched her do it for a few minutes, then started sorting from his side using the same system without being asked to. They worked in silence for a while, not the heavy silence of dinner, but something more functional, the silence of two people sharing a task. "This one," Emily said after a time, holding up a folded paper. "It's dated 1863. It looks like an official survey amendment." Jacob took it from her and read it. His jaw tightened. "This is exactly what the lawyer needs. This amends the original boundary description, and it's got the county seal." "Your father knew this existed." "Of course he knew." Jacob set the paper carefully on the government seal pile. "He just didn't tell anyone who didn't need to know. That was my father's way." He paused. "He didn't trust easily." Emily glanced up at him. "Must be a family trait." Something happened to Jacob's expression. It was fast, too fast to be performed. Just a flicker of something caught off guard, and then he looked back at the papers. But his mouth moved, and she realized after a moment that it was the beginning of a smile he'd stopped before it finished. She looked back down at her own pile and said nothing. They found 3 more relevant documents in the next hour. By the time the lamp had burned down a 1/4 inch, Emily had organized the entire box, created a summary list for the lawyer, and Jacob had written notes on the most important pieces. In a hand she now recognized economical small, no wasted strokes. "That's enough for tonight," he said. Emily stacked the last pile and stood stretching her back. "I'll write the summary letter to the lawyer tomorrow morning. If you want to look it over before Pete takes it to town. I trust you to write it correctly." She looked at him. He was looking at the papers. "Jacob." He looked up. "You should win this," she said. "The evidence is solid. The law is on your side. Don't let anyone tell you to settle for less than what's yours." The words sat in the air between them, and she was aware suddenly that they might mean more than the land boundary, and that he was aware of it too. The moment stretched 1 beat past comfortable. Then Jacob said quietly, "Good night, Emily." "Good night," she said, and went to her room. She didn't sleep for an hour. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind off the ridge, and thought about a half-finished smile, and decided firmly that she was not going to think about it any more tonight. She thought about it for another 40 minutes before she finally slept. The next morning, Danny came to the kitchen with a cut on his forearm and a sheepish expression. Emily cleaned and wrapped it without comment, and he bore it with the stoic silence of someone who wanted to seem tougher than the wince he was suppressing suggested. "How?" she said. "Fence wire." "On the south pasture." He blinked. "How'd you know?" "Because that's where Jacob's been spending most of his attention, and where work is happening fastest. You were probably rushing." She tied off the bandage. "Done." Danny looked at his arm, then at her. "You notice a lot." "It's a useful habit." "Mr. Whitaker noticed too," Danny said with the studied casualness of someone delivering information they think is important. "He told Cole this morning that since you started going through the supply ledgers, he hasn't had to think about the house at all. Said it was like—" Danny hesitated, working to remember the exact words. "Like someone took a rock off his back that he'd gotten so used to carrying, he forgot it was there." Emily tied the last knot on the bandage with slightly more precision than required. "That's a very specific thing to remember." "I have a good memory," Danny said. for things that matter. He left before she could tell him to. She stood at the kitchen counter and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of something warm before she shut it down and started on the morning bread. The twist that changed everything came on a Thursday, and it arrived in the form of a rider Emily didn't recognize. She was in the yard hanging the week's washing when she heard the horse, too fast, too loud, not the easy pace of someone with ordinary business. She turned and saw a man pulling up at the gate, well-dressed for the territory, city-dressed almost with the kind of hat that said he hadn't done much outdoor work in recent years. He swung down and looked around the yard with the proprietary ease of a man who assumed he was welcome. His eyes landed on Emily. "This Whitaker Ranch." "It is." "I need to speak to Jacob Whitaker." "He's in the south field. Who should I say is calling?" The man looked her up and down with an assessment that had nothing to do with figuring out who she was and everything to do with deciding how much she mattered. He apparently decided not much. "Gerald Crenshaw," he said. "He'll know the name." Emily kept her face neutral. Crenshaw. The same family that had been taking Jacob's South 40 for 2 seasons. The same family Jacob was preparing to take to court. And Gerald Crenshaw was here uninvited, unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, which meant either he'd heard about the lawyer's involvement, or someone had told him about the documents they'd found in the study. "I'll send word," Emily said. "You can wait by the porch." She sent Danny to fetch Jacob, and then she did not go inside. She stayed in the yard at the washing because she wanted to see Gerald Crenshaw's face when Jacob walked up. Jacob came around from the south side 10 minutes later. He was moving faster than his usual careful pace, which told Emily that Danny had told him the name. He stopped in front of Crenshaw, and they regarded each other, and Emily watched from the washing line close enough to hear every word. "Gerald," Jacob said. "Jake." Crenshaw had a broad, easy smile that didn't connect to his eyes at all. "It's been a while. You're looking well." "I'm looking like a man who's waiting to hear why you're on my property." Crenshaw spread his hands, a gesture meant to convey openness that accomplished the opposite. "I heard you've been in contact with a Helena lawyer about the south boundary." "That's correct. Now, Jake, there's no need to make this complicated. We've been neighbors for 20 years. Our families have been neighbors. This is the kind of thing that can get resolved between reasonable men without dragging lawyers and courts into it." Jacob said nothing. "I'm prepared to make you a fair offer," Crenshaw continued. "Compensation for any confusion over the grazing. A payment generous, and we settle the boundary question the way it's always been understood locally, without." "The way it's always been understood locally," Jacob said, "is that your cattle have been on my land, and your name has been on the county record for property that belongs to me." Crenshaw's smile flickered, just briefly. "That's a strong way to characterize. My father surveyed that boundary in 1861. I have the original survey. I have a 1863 amendment with the county seal. I have 2 decades of tax records showing my family paying taxes on land you've been using for free." Jacob's voice was level, not loud, just absolutely immovably clear. "There is no compensation offer that covers 2 years of theft, Gerald. And there's no version of this that gets resolved between reasonable men, because what you did wasn't reasonable." Crenshaw's expression changed. The easy smile dropped entirely, and what replaced it was harder and less polished. "You'd be smart to think carefully about this, Jake. Going up against a Crenshaw in county court with your situation people in this valley know what happened to you in those mountains. They know what you are now. And a judge who knows this community is going to look at documented evidence," Emily said. Both men turned. She had moved closer to the porch without fully deciding to, and her voice had come out before she'd decided to use it. Crenshaw looked at her the way he'd looked at her before the calculation, the dismissal. Jacob looked at her differently. "Who is this?" Crenshaw said. "Emily Whitaker," she said. She had never used that name before. The words came out steady, no hesitation. "Jacob's wife." She felt Jacob go very still beside her. "And you're right," she continued, looking directly at Gerald Crenshaw. that a judge knows this community, which means he knows the Whitaker family and what they built here. It also means he'll know you rode out to offer a settlement the week after a Helena lawyer got involved, which doesn't look like a reasonable man resolving a misunderstanding. It looks like a man who suddenly realized the evidence he thought was buried is about to surface in a courtroom. The silence that followed was its own kind of event. Crenshaw looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Jacob. His jaw worked once. "Think on it," he said finally. The easy tone was completely gone. "That offer won't stay on the table long." He walked back to his horse mounted and rode out of the yard without looking back. Emily stood very still. She was aware that her heart was going considerably faster than the situation probably warranted. She was also aware that Jacob was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. "Emily Whitaker," he said. She turned to face him. "I apologize. I didn't intend to. It came out. You told a Crenshaw that the evidence was about to surface in a courtroom. He was going to use your injury against you. I wasn't going to stand there and let him do it." Jacob studied her for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he said very quietly, "You stepped in front of a Crenshaw for me." "He wasn't going to shoot me, Jacob." "That's not the point." "Then what's the point?" He looked at her with that gray stone gaze and something behind it that she had seen in flickers before, but never this fully, this close. "Nobody has done that in 2 years, he said. "Stood in front of something coming at me. Everyone just steps back, waits to see if I fall." Emily held his gaze. "I'm not everyone." The moment held. Jacob looked away first. He cleared his throat. He shifted his cane. He said, "I need to send a letter to the lawyer today. Today, not tomorrow." "I'll have it ready in an hour," Emily said. "Good." He started toward the house, then stopped without turning. "Thank you." She watched him go. She stood in the yard alone and let out a breath she had been holding for considerably longer than the conversation. Danny materialized from the direction of the barn with the supernatural timing she had come to expect from him. He looked at her, looked at the gate where Crenshaw had ridden out, looked back at her. "That was something," he said. "Go fix a fence, Danny." He went, but he was grinning. That evening at dinner, the silence was different again. It had been different every week she'd noticed this evolving by degrees, the quality of it changing the way a season changes, not dramatically, not in any single day you could point to, but undeniably when you stepped back and looked at the span. This silence had something under the surface of it, something that had been said in the yard that afternoon and hadn't been fully concluded. Jacob set his fork down after a few minutes and said without preamble, "What made you say it, Emily Whitaker?" She had expected this. She'd thought about how to answer it. "I told you. He was about to use your injury to imply you weren't capable of—" "I heard what you said to him. I'm asking what made you decide that was your fight to step into." Emily folded her hands on the table. "Because it was happening in front of me." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have." She met his eyes. "I don't have a complicated reason, Jacob. He was treating you like you were already defeated, and you're not. Anyone who's spent 3 weeks in this house knows you're not." Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "You've been here 3 weeks. Almost 4. And you've decided I'm not defeated." "I've decided you're angry," she said. "Which is not the same thing. Defeated people stop being angry. You haven't." He looked at her across the table with that expression she'd seen in the yard, the one that seemed like it was revising something fundamental. "My leg isn't going to improve," he said. "The doctor was clear about that." "I know. I'm never going to be what I was in those mountains." "I know that too." "Then why—" He stopped, started differently. "Most people look at what I can't do anymore. You seem to be looking at something else. What you can still do," she said simply. "There's more of it than you're willing to admit." The lamp between them burned steady. Outside the window, the evening settled over the ranch. Jacob sat with whatever she'd said, and she didn't rush him, and she didn't fill the silence with anything smaller. Finally, he said, "I sent a message to the Helena lawyer this afternoon. I told him the settlement offer from Crenshaw should be declined in writing immediately and that we'd be filing the documents as planned." Emily nodded. "Good. I also told him." Jacob paused. "I told him there may be additional evidence of corruption in Henderson's office. More than just the boundary record. If Crenshaw bought Henderson's cooperation on our land, he may have done it elsewhere. The lawyer is going to look into it." Emily felt something shift in her chest. Not surprised she'd seen this coming in the way Jacob's mind worked, the way he never stopped at the surface of a problem. That's bigger than a boundary dispute. Yes, that's going after a county official. Yes. She held his gaze. That could make enemies. "I already have enemies," Jacob said. "I'd rather have the right ones." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're going to need more than a Helena lawyer for that." "I know." He picked up his fork again. "I'm going to need someone who can organize what we find and present it clearly. Someone who already knows the documents." He looked at her. Someone who works out of this house. She understood what he was asking, what he was trusting her with. "Then I'd better start going through the rest of those files," she said. He nodded, looked back at his food, said with a casualness so studied it was its own kind of declaration, "The stew tonight, better than last week." Emily looked down at her plate and allowed herself a small private smile he didn't see. "Sage again," she said. "And a little thyme." "Keep it," he said. And just like that, without either of them deciding to cross it, the line between arrangement and something else moved a few more inches in a direction neither of them was ready to name. But both of them, in the quiet of their own thoughts that night, could no longer entirely pretend they hadn't noticed. The files in the study took over the dining room table by the end of the first week of searching. Emily had developed a new system broader than the one she'd used for the boundary documents, because what they were looking for now was bigger and less defined. Not a single survey record with a county seal. Something murkier. A pattern. The kind of evidence that doesn't announce itself with a government stamp, but hides in the gaps between what should be there and what isn't. Jacob worked alongside her every evening after dinner. That had become the shape of their nights. Now dinner, then the table, then hours of documents with the lamp burning between them. The ranch hands had noticed. Danny had stopped making comments about it, which meant he'd graduated from curious to observant, which Emily found more unsettling than the commentary. On the fourth evening of the expanded search, Emily found the first real thread. She almost missed it. It was a property transfer document from 1879, not Whitaker land, not anything directly connected to Jacob's boundary dispute. A parcel on the north side of the valley transferred from a widow named Clara Holt to a land company Emily had never heard of. The transfer price was recorded, and the price was wrong. Not obviously wrong, you'd have to know what the land was worth, have some sense of the valley's property values in that year, but wrong enough that it snagged something in the back of Emily's mind. She set it aside. 20 minutes later, she found another one. Different name, different parcel, different year. Same land company, same pattern of a price that sat just slightly below what the land should have been worth. She set that one beside the first. By the end of the night, she had 7 documents in a separate pile. 7 properties, 7 transfers, all to the same company, all at prices that were close enough to reasonable to avoid scrutiny, all carrying Henderson's signature as county assessor. She waited until Jacob had set down his own stack before she said anything. "Come look at this," she said. He came around the table and stood beside her. She walked him through it. The company name, the dates, the pattern of prices, Henderson's signature appearing on every single one. Jacob was quiet for a long time after she finished. "What's the land company?" he said. "I don't know yet. It's not a name I recognize." "I do." His voice had gone flat in a specific way she'd learned to read, not anger, not yet, but the place just before it, where everything becomes very still. "Territorial Holdings. It's Gerald Crenshaw's company. He set it up in '77 under a different name, his wife's family name. Most people in this valley don't know he owns it." Emily looked at the 7 documents, looked at him. "Jacob, this isn't just your boundary." "No," he said. "It isn't. He's been doing this for years, to multiple families." "Yes." "And Henderson has been signing off on every transfer." "Yes." Jacob straightened up. He was gripping the cane harder than usual. She could see the whitening of his knuckles. Clara Holt lost her farm 2 years after her husband died. People in town said she just couldn't manage it alone. Said it was sad but inevitable. He paused. She was managing fine. She had good land, and she'd run it herself for 3 years. And then suddenly, she sold it for half what it was worth to a company nobody could trace back to Crenshaw, and 6 months later, she was in town taking in laundry. The weight of that settled over both of them. "We need to send this to the lawyer," Emily said. "Tonight. Or first thing tomorrow." "Tomorrow morning. I want to write the letter myself on this one." He looked at the pile of 7 documents. "I want to be very precise about what we're alleging." "All right." Emily started to organize the documents into order. "Jacob." "What?" "Crenshaw came here because he heard about the lawyer. If he finds out the scope of what we've found, he'll do more than make an offer." Jacob said it without hesitation, which meant he'd already been thinking it. "I know." "Then we need to move quickly." "We will." He put his hand on the table beside the documents, not reaching for her, not quite just placing it there, near the work they'd done together. "Emily, this is what you found tonight. I wouldn't have seen it." "You would have eventually. Maybe. But you saw it first and faster, and you understood what it meant before I explained it." He looked at her with an expression that was completely unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. "I want you to know I understand what that's worth." She held his gaze for a moment. "Then let's make sure it counts for something," she said. He nodded, pushed back from the table. "First thing tomorrow." She watched him go down the hall. She sat alone at the table with 7 documents that represented 7 families, and however many more were buried in the Valley records they hadn't gotten to yet. And she felt something she recognized from the worst and best moments of her life. The sensation of standing at the edge of something that is about to become very large and very serious and cannot be undone once it starts. She was not afraid. That surprised her slightly. She put the documents in order and went to bed. Jacob's letter to the Helena lawyer went out with Pete before sunrise. By mid-morning, Emily was back in the files. By noon, she had found 4 more suspicious transfers. By the time Jacob came in from the South Fields in the afternoon, the number was 11. He looked at the new pile without sitting down. His jaw was set. "There's a pattern in the timing," Emily said. "Every transfer happens within 6 months of a death or a serious financial hardship. Henderson files the amended deed before anyone thinks to contest it." "He's waiting for vulnerable moments," Jacob said. "He's manufacturing them, maybe. Or at least watching for them." She tapped a document near the top of the pile. "Look at this one. Robert Carey, 1881. He had a fire in his barn, lost most of his livestock. 3 months later, he sold his north pasture to Territorial Holdings. The price is low, but not insultingly low. Low enough to seem like mercy." She looked up. "Someone who was already scared and desperate might take it. Someone who didn't know who was on the other side of the offer," Jacob said. "Exactly." Jacob pulled a chair to the table and sat. He picked up the Carey document and read it in full. Then he set it down with a kind of careful precision that Emily recognized the control of a man who is very angry and has decided to be useful instead. "The lawyer needs to contact the land office in Helena," he said. "There will be records of Territorial Holdings' full property portfolio. If we can match that against the county records here, we can map the whole operation," Emily finished. "Yes." He looked at her. "Can you draft a second letter today? Separate from mine. I want 2 independent accounts of what we've found going to Helena. If something happens to one, I'll write it this afternoon." He nodded. Then after a pause, "I'm going to write out to Clara Holt." Emily looked up sharply. "She's in town?" Taking in laundry off Merchant Street. She was here 20 years before the Crenshaws. She deserves to know what we found." He stood. "And she may know more than we do." "Do you want me to come?" He considered it. "Not yet. Let me speak to her first. She doesn't know you, and what I need from her is trust, and she may find it harder with a stranger present." He paused at the study door. "But when I come back, I may need you to write down what she tells me, word for word." "I'll be here," Emily said. He left. She wrote the second letter to the Helena lawyer, documented the 11 properties in a summary table, and tried not to think about the fact that Jacob Whittaker had just said, "When I come back," with the uncomplicated certainty of a man who expected someone to be waiting. He came back 2 hours later with a face that told her everything before he said a word. He sat down at the table across from her and put his hat on the chair beside him and said, "Clara Holt knows." Emily set her pen down. She knew about Crenshaw. She suspected, but she had no proof and no money for a lawyer and no family left to help her fight it. He pressed his hands flat on the table. "She told me that Henderson came to her personally, came to her house, told her the property taxes were in arrears, which they weren't, she'd paid them, and that if she couldn't prove it, she'd face foreclosure. She had receipts, but they were in her husband's name, and Henderson told her they weren't legally valid after his death." His voice was even, steady. "That was a lie. A deliberate lie from a county official to a widow who didn't have anyone to tell her otherwise." Emily felt cold. How long ago was this? 3 years. Jacob looked at her. "She said there was another woman. Margaret Dean. Lost her property the same way 18 months ago. She's living with her daughter now in Billings, and Clara thinks there are others she doesn't know about." "There are," Emily said quietly. She pushed the summary table toward him. 11 confirmed. There may be more. Jacob looked at the table, read it in silence. Then he said, "This needs to go higher than a Helena lawyer." "How much higher?" "Federal level. Land fraud at this scale involving a county official, the U.S. Marshal's Office in Helena has jurisdiction." Emily absorbed that. "That's a significant escalation." "Yes. Crenshaw will find out, and Henderson. If this reaches federal level, they'll know it reached federal level." "I know. Jacob." She held his gaze. "If they've been doing this for years and nobody's stopped them, they have influence. Real influence. You going to the federal level means, it means they'll come after me," he said, directly. He said it with the same flatness he'd used to describe the theft. Just facts. Just what was true. "I know that, Emily. I've known it since the night you found the first 7 documents." He picked up his hat from the chair beside him and turned it once in his hands. "But Clara Holt is taking in laundry because a county official lied to her face and no one made it right. And there are at least 10 more people in this valley in the same position." He set the hat down. "I can fight this, or I can let it stand. And I've been letting things stand for 2 years, and I'm done with it." Emily looked at him for a long moment. There was something different in his face tonight, something she'd seen only in pieces before, in flickers and half-expressions, always there and always controlled. But tonight it was fully present. The man Danny had described, the one who'd made people want to work harder, just by raising his voice, the one who'd tracked grizzlies at elevation, the one who'd existed before the accident, stripped him back to bone. He was still in there. He'd been in there all along. She said, "Then we write to the marshal's office tonight." He looked at her. "You're sure?" "I found the documents," she said. "I'm already in it." Something moved across his face. Not the half-smile she'd seen before. Something more serious, more settled. He said, "All right." Then the back door opened, and Danny came through it faster than he should have. No knock, no hesitation, which meant something was wrong before he said a word. "Mr. Whittaker?" Danny's voice was wrong too tight. "Someone cut the north fence." Jacob was on his feet immediately. All of it. "Long section. Cole found it 20 minutes ago. The horses from the upper pasture are out." "How many?" 6 head, maybe 7. Cole's got 2 of the hands on it, but they're heading toward the canyon, and if they get into the gully before dark... Jacob was already moving toward the door cane, striking the floor in rapid beats. Emily was behind him before she'd consciously decided to move. "You can't go into that gully on foot," she said. "Not in the dark, not on that ground. I know my own land. Jacob." He stopped at the door, turned and looked at her with an expression that was not anger and not pride, but something between them raw and immediate, and too honest to argue with. "I know," he said again, quieter. "I know I can't." The words cost him. She could hear it. "But I need someone who can ride fast and knows which way the canyon breaks north." Emily said, "I can ride." He looked at her. She'd never mentioned it. It hadn't come up. "I grew up riding," she said. "My father had horses before he lost the shop. I'm not fast, but I'm capable." Something shifted in Jacob's decision-making. She could see it happening, the recalculation, the reluctant recognition. "Danny goes with you," he said. "You follow the fence line to where it breaks, then cut north. The canyon splits at the big rock formation. You'll feel it before you see it in the dark. Take the left branch. The horses always take the left branch. I don't know why they just do." "Left branch," Emily said. "All right. Don't push past the second creek crossing. If they're not there, come back and we'll pick it up at dawn." "Understood." "Emily." His hand came out just briefly, just a touch at her arm, there and gone. "Be careful." She held his gaze for 1 second. "I'll bring your horses back." She went. She brought 5 of them back. The other 2 were recovered by Cole's men an hour later, at the far end of the left branch, exactly where Jacob had predicted. She came back into the yard with Danny beside her and 5 horses on a lead line, and found Jacob standing at the gate with a lantern. He'd been there a while, she could tell. He watched them ride in with an expression she couldn't fully read in the lantern light. When she dismounted, he looked her over in the quick, practiced way of a man checking for injury. "You're all right?" "Fine." She handed the lead to Danny, who took it without comment, and led the horses toward the barn, with the discretion of someone who understood his presence had become surplus. The fence line was cut cleanly. Not broken, cut. She held his gaze. Wire cutters. Someone did it deliberately. Jacob's expression didn't change, but she felt the stillness in him deepen. When, sometime today, the cut ends were still bright, not weathered. "While we were here, while the letter to Helena was being written." He said it quietly, like a piece fitting into a pattern he'd already started seeing. "Crenshaw," Emily said, "or Henderson, or someone they pay." He looked toward the north fence line, invisible in the dark. "They know we're moving. How? I don't know." His jaw tightened. "Pete went to town with the first letter this morning. Someone may have seen him at the lawyer's. Small towns notice." Emily thought about this. "Then we need to move faster than they expect." "Yes." He turned back to her. His face in the lantern light was very close to something open, something she didn't have a clean name for. "You rode well tonight. I told you I could ride. You told me you were capable. That's not always the same thing. Tonight it was." He stood very still, looking at her. The lantern between them threw everything into gold and shadow. She was aware of being tired and relieved, and something else that had been building for weeks, and had been choosing this particular moment inconveniently to become difficult to ignore. "Jacob," she said. "Don't," he said quietly. Not harshly, just a warning. To himself as much as to her, she thought. She said, "I wasn't going to say anything. I know." A pause. "That's the problem." Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Jacob said, "Get some rest. Tomorrow we write to the marshal, and we don't stop until it's sent." He turned toward the house. "And Emily, thank you. For tonight. For all of it." She watched him go. She stood in the yard with the lantern swinging slightly in the night wind, and let herself feel fully, just for a moment, how thoroughly this had stopped being what she'd told herself it was: an arrangement, a business exchange, a necessity. It wasn't that anymore. She wasn't sure it had ever really been that. But it was definitely not that now. She went inside. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Thomas's photograph on the windowsill and thought, I came here to save you. I am still going to save you. But something else is happening here too, and I don't know how to be careful enough about it. She didn't sleep much, but in the morning she was at the kitchen table before dawn with fresh paper and a clear head. And she wrote the letter to the U.S. Marshal's office in Helena with the precision of someone who understood that the words on this page would change everything. When Jacob came in and read it, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This is exactly right." "I know," she said. He looked up at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "You could have been a lawyer. I could have been a lot of things," Emily said. "I'm here." Jacob held her gaze across the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window, and the letter between them, the letter that was about to set fire to Gerald Crenshaw's carefully constructed world, and said nothing. But he didn't look away. And this time, neither did she. The letter to the U.S. Marshal's office went out with Pete before 7 in the morning, tucked inside a second envelope addressed to the Helena lawyer with instructions to hand-deliver it personally. Jacob had decided the night before that nothing else went through the regular mail. Too many eyes between Whitaker Ranch and the territorial capital. Too many opportunities for something to disappear before it arrived. Emily had agreed without needing to be convinced. By the time the sun was fully up, she was back in the files. There was more to find. She could feel it the way you feel. A loose thread before you find it with your fingers, that sense of something not quite sitting right in the fabric. She pulled every transfer document Henderson had signed in the past 5 years and laid them out in chronological order and started cross-referencing names. Jacob came in at mid-morning and stopped in the doorway when he saw how far she'd spread across the table. "How many?" he said. 14 confirmed. I think there are 3 more, but the records are incomplete. There are gaps in the county filings that shouldn't be there. She looked up. Someone removed documents, Jacob. Not all of them. Just enough to make the pattern harder to see. He crossed to the table and stood looking at the spread of papers. Henderson. Has to be. He controls access to the county records office. She pointed to 2 consecutive dates in the filing log she'd been reconstructing. There are 5 days missing from September 1880. 5 days where nothing was filed or recorded, which is impossible for a functioning county office. Someone went back and pulled what was in there. Can we prove it? The gaps themselves are proof. A missing record is still a record of absence. She looked at him. The lawyer will understand that. Jacob was quiet for a moment looking at the table. Then he said, "Cole found boot prints along the north fence this morning. Fresh ones. Someone was watching the ranch yesterday, not just cutting the fence." Emily went still. "Watching from where?" "The ridge above the east pasture. You can see the main house from there. The study window." He said it without drama, just facts, but she heard what was underneath it. "They know we're in the documents. Then they know what we might find. Yes? Which means they're scared." "Scared people do things," Jacob said. "That's what worries me." Emily looked at the 14 documents on the table. 14 families. 14 properties. Years of it running right under the surface of the valley, while everyone looked at the obvious things and missed what was happening in the county records office on the days when nobody was paying attention. She said, "What do you want to do?" "Keep going," he said, without hesitation. "Faster." She nodded. "Then sit down and help me." He sat down. They worked through the midday without stopping for a proper meal. Danny brought food to the doorway and left it without being asked, which was either intuition or the result of observing the mood of the house and deciding that interrupting it was inadvisable. Emily ate without stopping. Jacob ate the same way. By early afternoon, the count was 17, and then Emily found Margaret Dean. She'd heard the name from Jacob the night he came back from Clara Holt. the woman who'd lost her property and gone to live with her daughter in Billings. She'd been looking for the deed transfer documents, but hadn't been able to find them in the county files. Now she understood why. "The Dean property isn't transferred to territorial holdings," she said slowly, reading the document in her hand. "It's transferred to Henderson, personally." Jacob looked up from across the table. "Not the company. Henderson's own name is on this deed." She set the document between them. "He didn't even bother to run it through Crenshaw's company. He just took it." Jacob picked up the document. Read every word. His face went very still in the way she'd learned to read, as the outer edge of something that had no safe outlet. He took her land outright, under his own name, which means he wasn't just processing Crenshaw's transfers. He was running his own operation alongside it. Emily held his gaze. "Jacob, they're not partners. They're competitors. They've both been doing this independently, covering for each other because it was mutually beneficial." The silence after that was the kind that reorganizes what you thought you understood. "If they're not fully aligned," Jacob said carefully, "then Crenshaw might not know about the Dean property. And Henderson might not know how much Crenshaw has taken. Which means, if the marshal starts asking questions, they'll both be looking for a way to make the other one the primary target." Emily leaned forward. "They'll give each other up." Jacob set the document down. He looked at Emily across the table with an expression that was complicated admiration and gravity in equal measure. "You think like a lawyer." "I think like someone who has spent 4 weeks reading other people's dishonesty," she said. "It starts to show a pattern." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Then Danny appeared in the doorway for the second time that day, and his expression this time was nothing like the careful discretion of midday. "Mr. Whitaker?" He was breathing faster than he should have been. "There's a man at the gate. Not Crenshaw. Don't know him. He's got a badge." Jacob and Emily looked at each other. "Marshal's office," Jacob said. "That was fast," Emily said. "Too fast." He was already standing. "The letter went out this morning. Helena is 2 days by hard ride. No one could have gotten here from Helena." They both understood what that meant at the same moment. "Local," Emily said. "He's a local deputy, which means Henderson knows." Jacob moved to the door. "Stay here." "I will not," she said, and followed him. The man at the gate was younger than Emily expected, mid-30s, lean, with a deputy's badge on his vest that caught the afternoon sun. He had a neutral face, the kind that gave nothing away by design, and he held his horse with the easy authority of someone comfortable in the role. He looked at Jacob. "Jacob Whitaker." "That's right. Deputy Hal Carver. I'm out of the county sheriff's office." He tipped his hat briefly in Emily's direction. "Ma'am?" Then back to Jacob. "I'm here regarding a complaint filed this morning with the sheriff by Mr. Gerald Crenshaw. He's alleging that you've been in possession of county property records without authorization and have made false allegations against him and County Assessor Henderson to a Helena law firm." The air in the yard went very specific. Jacob said, "Crenshaw filed a complaint against me." "This morning, yes, sir." "For looking at county records?" "For alleged unauthorized possession of." "Those records are my father's private documents," Jacob said. "Filed in his own study for 30 years. There is nothing county-owned in this house." His voice was perfectly level. "Tell me, Deputy Carver, did you read the complaint before you rode out here?" Carver hesitated, just briefly. "I'm required to follow up on complaints filed with the office. I understand. And I'm telling you the factual basis of that complaint is false." Jacob held the deputy's gaze. "I'd also like to tell you something else. My wife and I have spent the last week reviewing documents that show a pattern of fraudulent land transfers in this county going back at least 7 years. 17 properties minimum, coordinated between Gerald Crenshaw's company Territorial Holdings and County Assessor Henderson, and in at least one case, Henderson acting in his own name without Crenshaw's involvement." He paused. "I sent a letter to the U.S. Marshal's office in Helena this morning. I expect a federal response within the week. I'm informing you now as a professional courtesy deputy, because when that response arrives, you'll want to have been on the right side of this." Carver was very quiet for a moment. Something had shifted in his neutral face, not much, but enough. He looked at Emily. She held his gaze without expression. He looked back at Jacob. "You have documentation. 17 sets of it, plus correspondence deed records and a county filing log with 5 unexplained days missing from September 1880. Jacob let that sit. All of it organized, summarized, and ready for federal review. Carver was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Mr. Whitaker, I'm going to be straight with you." "I appreciate straight," Jacob said. "Henderson came to the sheriff's office himself this morning, before Crenshaw filed the complaint. He told Sheriff Bates you'd been making accusations and that it was the behavior of a man who'd—" Carver stopped. "Say it," Jacob said. Carver met his eyes. "A man who'd lost his grip on things since the accident." The yard was silent. Emily said very quietly, "And does Sheriff Bates agree with that assessment?" Carver looked at her. His jaw moved once. "I came out here myself, ma'am, instead of sending someone else. That should tell you something." It did tell them something. Emily looked at Jacob. Jacob said, "Deputy Carver, would you like to come inside and look at 17 years of documented evidence?" A pause. Then, "Yes." Carver said, "I think I would." Carver spent 2 hours at the table. He read slowly and carefully, and he didn't speak much while he read, which Emily respected. When he was finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "Henderson signed every one of these," he said. "Everyone," Emily confirmed. "And the dean deed is in his personal name." "Yes." Carver looked at Jacob. "I've been in this county 4 years. Henderson was here before I arrived. He stopped. "He's on the committee that approves the sheriff's office budget." "I know," Jacob said. "Which means Sheriff Bates is not going to move on this without federal direction." "I know that too." Carver looked at the documents again. He picked up the dean deed, Henderson's name clear and unmistakable in the county clerk's formal script. He set it down carefully. When the marshal's office responds, he said, "I want to be the contact point, not Bates. Me." He met Jacob's eyes. "I took this job because I believed in what it was supposed to be, not what it's become in this county." Jacob said, "Then be what it's supposed to be." Carver nodded once tightly. He stood. He put on his hat and looked at Emily. "Ma'am, that summary document you prepared, I'd like a copy to hold personally, not filed with the sheriff's office. My own copy." Emily was already writing. The day after Carver's visit, Gerald Crenshaw made his second mistake. His first had been cutting the north fence. His second was sending a man to Pete. Pete came back from his regular supply run to town in the afternoon, moving fast and walking straight to Jacob before he'd put the horses up, which was not Pete's way. Pete's way was unhurried, methodical, one thing at a time. When Pete moved fast, it meant something. He found Jacob in the south field and said flat and straight, "Man approached me on Merchant Street, said his name was Fowler, said he had a message for you." "What message?" "Said the business with the lawyer and the complaints and all the rest of it would go away clean if you were willing to accept the original boundary settlement from Crenshaw." "Said if you weren't willing—" Pete paused. He was a man of 60-odd years, and he'd seen a great deal, and very little moved him visibly. His face right now was moved. "Said if you weren't willing, things could get complicated for people connected to you." He said the word people, and then he looked at me direct, and then he walked away. Jacob stood very still in the south field, with the afternoon wind coming down off the granite ridge. "He threatened you," Jacob said. "He implied," Pete said, "which is worse in my experience because it leaves more room." Jacob came back to the house and found Emily in the kitchen and told her in precise, even words exactly what Pete had reported. He watched her face while he told her. She didn't go pale. She didn't look frightened. She looked, if anything, resolved in a way that had hardened at the edges. When he finished, she said, "They're trying to scare us into stopping before the federal response arrives." "Yes." "Which means they know the federal response is coming. Someone in Helena talked, or someone intercepted. It doesn't matter how they know," Emily said. "They know, and they're frightened enough to threaten a man on Merchant Street in broad daylight, which means they're not thinking clearly anymore." She looked at Jacob. "Frightened people make mistakes. They also get dangerous." "I know." She held his gaze. "Jacob, are you going to stop?" He looked at her. The question sat between them, and he didn't answer it quickly, which she knew by now was not hesitation, but the refusal to say something untrue just because it was fast. "No," he said. "Then neither am I." She turned back to the counter. "I need Pete to go back to town, not to the supply store, to Clara Holt." "Why?" "Because if Crenshaw is frightened enough to threaten Pete on Merchant Street, Clara Holt is not safe staying where she is. She's a witness, and she has information, and she's a woman alone in town." Emily looked at Jacob over her shoulder. "We need to bring her here." Jacob was silent for a moment. Then, "She won't want charity." "Then offer her a job. I could genuinely use help with the household, especially now." "It's not charity if it's true." Another moment. Something in his face that was again that expression she saw in pieces. The one that didn't have a clean name. The one that was too much of several things at once. "All right," he said. "I'll speak to Pete." He sent Pete back to town within the hour with a letter for Clara Holt in Jacob's own handwriting, not Emily's, because this needed to come from the Whitaker name, needed to carry the weight of it. Emily read it before it went, and didn't suggest a single change. Jacob had written it simply and directly, and with a dignity that made the offer feel like what it was, one neighbor reaching out a hand to another in the middle of something that had gotten larger than either of them planned. Clara Holt arrived the following morning with a single bag and the careful posture of a woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She was 60, maybe a little more, with strong hands and eyes that had seen a great deal and stopped being surprised by most of it. She looked at the ranch and the house, and then she looked at Emily, who had come out to meet her, and she said, "You're the one who found the documents." "Yes," Emily said. "Then I owe you a debt." "You don't owe me anything," Emily said. "Come inside." Clara Holt at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the specific stillness of someone who had been afraid for a long time and was trying to decide if the fear was allowed to rest, told them things they hadn't found in any document. She told them that Henderson had come to her with a man she didn't recognize, not Crenshaw, not anyone from the valley. A city man. He had a Helena accent, she said. Or maybe further east. And he knew things about our finances that he shouldn't have known. Not just the property taxes, our bank account. What was in it? Jacob went very still. "The bank in Millhaven. The same bank this valley has used for 30 years. Clara said. "The bank where everyone keeps their records." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I always thought it was strange that Henderson knew exactly how much hardship would break a family. He never asked too much too soon. He always waited until the moment when the number he offered was just enough to keep you from losing everything else." She paused. "That's not instinct. That's information." Emily looked at Jacob. "The bank," she said. "Someone inside the bank," he said with the tone of a man adding a piece to a structure that just changed shape under his hands. "Or the bank itself," Clara said. They both looked at her. She looked back at them without apology. "I'm an old woman who lost her farm. I've had 3 years to think about how it happened, and the bank president in Millhaven has a very nice new house for someone in a county this size." The silence in the kitchen was a specific kind, the kind where 3 people are all arriving at the same conclusion from different directions, and all arriving at it at the same moment. "That goes in a separate letter," Emily said. "Tonight?" Jacob agreed. Clara looked between them. "You two have been busy." "We've had reason," Jacob said. Clara studied him for a long moment. She had known him before Emily could see the recalibration happening in the older woman's eyes, the comparison between the Jacob she'd known and the one sitting at this table now. "Your father would have done the same thing," she said finally. "Just so you know. He'd have been right here in this chair." Something passed through Jacob's face, quick, private, almost too fast to see. But Emily saw it. She looked down at her own hands so he wouldn't see that she'd seen it. "I know," he said, quiet. "Thank you, Clara." "No." The letter with the bank information went to Helena the next morning, with Pete under strict instructions to hand it to the Helena lawyer in person, and no one else. Jacob had also sent a second copy separately addressed directly to the U.S. Marshal. Same information, different envelope, different route. He was not taking chances with the mail anymore. 2 days later, Pete came back from his supply run with something he hadn't been sent to collect, a sealed letter with a federal territorial seal on the envelope. He brought it directly to Jacob, who brought it directly to Emily, and they stood in the study, and Jacob opened it and read it, and then handed it to her without speaking. The U.S. Marshal's office in Helena had received their letter. They were sending an investigator. He would arrive within 5 days. They were to preserve all documents and make no further contact with Crenshaw Henderson or anyone associated with either of them. Emily read it twice. Then she handed it back. 5 days, she said. 5 days. Jacob confirmed. Then we spend 5 days making sure every document is organized, cross-referenced, and ready to hand over in a form that makes the investigator's job as simple as possible. Yes. She looked at him. He was looking at her. The federal letter was between them, and everything it meant was present in the room, the scope of what they'd built over the past weeks, the weight of it, the momentum that was now larger than either of them and couldn't be stopped. And underneath that, something else that also couldn't be stopped, that had been building the same way quietly and without announcing itself in the ordinary exchanges of difficult days. Jacob said very quietly, "Emily." She said, "I know." "I don't—" He stopped. "I'm not certain I know how to do this." "Do what?" He looked at her with the kind of directness that had no calculation in it, no wall, nothing managed or controlled. Just the actual thing exposed. Any of it. This. A gesture that seemed to mean the house, the case, the two of them at the same table. "I've been alone for 2 years, and I was starting to think that was permanent." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're not alone now." "No." The word was simple. Absolute. "I'm not." She held his gaze and didn't look away, and didn't say anything that would reduce it to something smaller than it was. Outside, Danny was crossing the yard toward the barn, whistling something tuneless, completely unaware. The ranch was moving through its afternoon routines. Clara Holt was in the kitchen starting on dinner. The federal letter sat on the desk between them with its territorial seal pressed into the paper like a promise. Jacob reached out and picked up the letter. He squared it carefully against the edge of the desk and set it with the other organized documents in the order Emily had established. Then he said, "I'm going to need your help with the investigator, presenting the case. You understand the documents better than I do at this point." "I'll be there," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "I'm starting to rely on that." She felt the words land somewhere they were going to stay for a long time. "Good," she said, and meant every letter of it. The 5 days before the investigator arrived were the longest and the shortest of Emily's life, depending on which hour you measured them by. Long, because every morning she woke before dawn, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Hoofbeats approaching too fast. Voices in the yard, anything that said Crenshaw or Henderson had decided not to wait for the federal process to run its course. Short because every hour was filled so completely with preparation that she would look up from the table and find the light had changed and half a day was gone. She and Jacob had divided the work without discussing how to divide it. He handled the ranch hands quietly, reassigning night rotations, making sure someone was always watching the perimeter fence, telling Cole and Danny enough of the situation that they understood the stakes without telling them so much that it frightened them into making decisions on their own. Emily handled the documents. She built a master index cross-referenced by name, date, property, location, and the specific legal violation each record demonstrated. She created a clean summary that a federal investigator could read in 30 minutes and understand fully, and a detailed supplementary set he could use for court. Clara Holt watched both of them do this and said on the third evening, "You two work like you've been doing it for years." Emily didn't look up from the index. "We've only been doing it for weeks." "That's what I mean," Clara said. Jacob across the table said nothing, but the back of his neck did something that in another man Emily might have called a flush. On the fourth night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed and ran through the index in her head, looking for gaps, testing the logic of the case they'd built. There were no gaps she could find. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't quite, because the absence of gaps in what you can see doesn't account for what you haven't seen yet. She was still lying there, eyes open in the dark, when she heard Jacob's cane in the hallway. Not moving toward her room, moving toward the front of the house, then the sound of the front door opening quietly. She got up. She found him on the front porch, standing at the rail looking out toward the ridge. He heard her come out but didn't turn. "Couldn't sleep," she said, not a question. "No." A pause. "You either?" "No." They stood in the dark together for a moment. The wind off the ridge was warm. It was deep summer now, the heat stored in the granite all day, releasing slowly through the night. The ranch was quiet. The hands on the night rotation were somewhere out along the fences, invisible. Jacob said, "When this is over." She waited. When the investigator comes and goes, and the case is in federal hands, and Crenshaw and Henderson are someone else's problem to prosecute. He stopped. "I've been thinking about what happens after that." Emily kept her eyes on the dark ridge. "What have you been thinking?" "That this arrangement," he stopped again, "started differently. What we agreed to in the beginning. What I offered your mother. A household manager, separate rooms, a business arrangement." He turned then and looked at her in the dark, and his voice was very even, but very deliberate. "I don't want to continue under those terms." Her heart did something significant. She kept her voice steady. "What terms do you want?" "Real ones," he said. "Whatever real means. I know I'm not the easiest man. I know this ranch is isolated and the work is hard, and I spent 2 years convinced I wasn't worth someone's genuine time. I'm not entirely sure I've stopped believing that." He held her gaze. "But I don't want to pretend anymore that what's been happening in this house is just an arrangement. It stopped being that a long time ago, and I think you know that as well as I do," Emily said. "I know it better than you do. I've known it longer." He blinked. That surprised him. She could see it, the slight shift of a man recalibrating. "How long?" "The wood box," she said. "The first week. When I left the porch lantern on, and came down in the morning, and the wood box was full." She looked at him. "Nobody does that for a business arrangement." Something moved across his face. The something she'd been seeing in pieces for weeks, always controlled, always managed, now allowed to be fully present. "I didn't know you'd connected it." "I connect things," she said. "It's what I do." He looked at her for a long moment. The ranch was quiet around them, the warm dark, the distant ridge. Then he said, "I want to write to your mother." "My mother. I want to write and tell her that the original terms of what we agreed are not the terms I'm asking to continue under. That what she arranged as a transaction has become something else, and that it became something else because of who her daughter is, and that Emily Carter—" He stopped, corrected himself. "Emily Whitaker is not here as payment for anything. She's here because I want her here, and that's an entirely different thing." Emily felt the words go all the way through her. She said, "You want to ask her permission?" "No." His voice was quiet but absolute. "I want to tell her the truth. Her daughter doesn't need anyone's permission for anything. I just want her to know that her daughter is—" A pause. "Safe. Valued. Not a transaction." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thomas." "What about him?" "When the money from the original arrangement runs out, his treatment costs aren't finished." She held his gaze. I'm not telling you this as a condition. I'm telling you because I want everything between us to be honest, and this is the part of my life that was already here before I arrived. I can't set Thomas aside." "I know that," Jacob said. "I knew that the first week. You have his photograph on your windowsill and you've written him twice since you got here, and you check the supply ledger for what's left in the medical expense column every Monday morning." He held her gaze. "I've already spoken to the lawyer about setting up a proper account for Thomas's ongoing care, not as part of the original arrangement, as something separate." Emily could not immediately speak. "Jacob, don't thank me," he said. "I did it because it's right. And because he's your brother, and you're—" He stopped. "You're not going anywhere. So he's not going anywhere either." She looked at him in the dark and felt something large and complete settle into place in her chest. Not the tentative, carefully managed thing she'd been protecting for weeks, but the real version of it, allowed to take up its full space for the first time. She said, "You are considerably more than difficult." He said, "Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation." And there it was, the full smile, unguarded, unmanaged, the one she'd seen in a fraction before, and only now saw complete. It changed his face entirely. It made him look like the man Danny had described, the one who'd made people want to work harder, the one who'd existed before the mountains took something from him. Emily thought, "There you are. There he is." She didn't say it, but she held it. The federal investigator arrived on the 5th day at noon. His name was Agent Robert Hale, out of the U.S. Marshal's Helena office, and he arrived with 2 deputies and no advance warning beyond the letter that had come 4 days earlier. He was a compact, serious man in his late 40s, with the kind of face that had processed a great deal and revealed very little of it. And he looked at Jacob and Emily when they came out to meet him with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to determining quickly who in a room was worth his time. He spent approximately 30 seconds looking at Emily's master index before he said, "Who prepared this?" "I did," Emily said. He looked at her. "You have legal training." "No, I have a good mind and 6 weeks of evidence." Hale looked at the index again, then at her. "All right," he said. "Just that." But the way he said it meant you will be useful in this room. They sat at the big table, Hale and his 2 deputies on one side, Jacob and Emily on the other. Clara Holt at the end, because Emily had asked her to be there, and Jacob had agreed immediately, and Emily walked Hale through the case the same way she'd walked it in her own head 100 times. Property by property, document by document, Henderson signatures, territorial holdings, the Dean deed in Henderson's personal name, the bank. Hale stopped her at the bank. "You have documentation of the bank connection," he said. "We have circumstantial documentation and a first-hand account from Clara Holt." She indicated Clara, who straightened slightly in her chair. "She can tell you what she told us. And the bank president's property records are public. His new house was purchased in 1881 for a figure that does not correspond to a county bank president's reasonable income in this territory." Hale looked at Clara. "Ma'am, I'd like to hear it from you directly." Clara told him, the same way she'd told Jacob and Emily, clear, precise, no embellishment. When she finished, Hale made a note and said, "The man with the Helena accent who accompanied Henderson. Can you describe him?" Clara described him. Hale made another note, and his face shifted very slightly enough that Emily noticed. "You recognize that description," Emily said. Hale looked at her. He considered her for a moment. Then he said, "There's a land speculator operating out of the territorial capital who has been under informal observation for 2 years. The description you've provided matches a man associated with him." A pause. "This goes further than your valley." The table was very quiet. "How much further?" Jacob said. "I'm not in a position to say with certainty. Yet." Hale gathered the top documents carefully. "What I can tell you is that what you've assembled here is the most organized evidentiary package I have received from a civilian source in 12 years of federal work." He glanced at Emily. "Ma'am, if you ever want a position with the Federal Land Office in Helena, "You have a recommendation." Emily said, "I have a ranch to run." Jacob beside her said absolutely nothing, but she felt him go very still, in a way that had warmth in it. Hale and his deputies stayed 2 days. They took copies of everything Emily had prepared, duplicate sets, and they interviewed Clara Holt formally, and Jacob at length, and Emily for nearly 3 hours on the second afternoon, going through the index line by line, asking her to explain her reasoning on each connection she'd drawn. She explained every one, clearly, precisely, without hesitation. When it was done, Hale said, "Mrs. Whitaker, you will very likely be called to testify before a federal grand jury." "I'm aware," she said. "I'll be ready." "I don't doubt it." He stood, and for the first time, the serious face showed something warmer. "You should know what you and your husband have done here is not a small thing. The families who lost property in this valley have a real chance of getting it back. That doesn't happen often. It happened because someone decided to look carefully at what was in front of her." Emily thought about Thomas's photograph on her windowsill, about her mother standing on the porch with her hand raised, about a wagon rattling into the mountains with her whole life in a cloth bag. She said, "Someone had to." The arrests came 11 days later. Henderson was taken from the county records office on a Tuesday morning by Deputy Carver, not Bates, because Hale had gone to the territorial governor's office about Bates, and the sheriff was currently under his own investigation. Carver had walked into Henderson's office with a federal warrant and 2 marshal's deputies and the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time to be exactly this version of himself. Crenshaw was arrested at his home by federal deputies the same morning. His wife watched from the doorway of their large house and said nothing, which Emily, when she heard about it, found its own kind of devastating. The bank president in Mill Haven was questioned the same afternoon. He did not wait to be arrested. He gave a full statement implicating the Helena speculator within the first hour. Pete brought the news back from town in the evening and delivered it to Jacob and Emily at the kitchen table, where they were eating dinner. Clara Holt across from them, Danny appearing in the doorway with the supernatural timing that had become a fixture of Emily's life. Pete said, "Henderson, Crenshaw, both taken this morning." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Clara Holt put her coffee cup down and pressed both hands flat on the table and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were bright. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Danny said from the doorway, "Does this mean the land? The families? Federal court will determine restitution?" Jacob said. "It takes time, but the evidence is solid." He looked at Danny. "Clara will get her farm back. The others have a real chance." Danny let out a breath. "Good," he said, simply. Then he disappeared back into the evening because Danny, when things mattered, knew when to leave the room to the people who needed it. Clara looked at Jacob, then at Emily. "I've been wondering," she said, "what I'm going to do with a farm again at my age." Emily said, "You'll figure it out." "I will," Clara agreed. She stood and took her coffee cup to the basin and said without turning around, "You two should take a walk. It's a fine evening, and this kitchen is going to smell like celebration, whether I cook something special or not, and I'd rather do that without an audience." She looked over her shoulder at them. "Go on." Jacob looked at Emily. Emily looked at Jacob. They went. The evening was warm, the kind of summer dark that holds the day's heat and gives it back slowly. They walked along the fence line east of the house, Jacob's pace measured and steady, the cane finding the ground, with the certainty of long practice, Emily matching him without thinking about it anymore, having long since found the natural rhythm of walking beside him. They didn't talk at first. There wasn't a need to. The thing that had been building toward this evening had been building for 6 weeks, and it didn't require words to exist. It just required the two of them in the same place, with no document to organize, and no letter to write, and no crisis arriving on horseback. Jacob said, after a while, "I want to ask you something." "Ask." "The night your mother told you about this arrangement." He kept his eyes forward. "What did you think when she first told you, before you had time to build the practical arguments around it?" Emily was quiet for a moment. She owed him honesty, and she knew it. "I thought I was going to disappear," she said. "Not die, just disappear. Become something useful that had stopped being a person." She paused. "I thought this is what happens to women when the money runs out. We get handed somewhere." Jacob absorbed that. "And now I think my mother made the worst decision of her life for the best reasons she had." Emily looked at the dark fence line ahead of them. "And I think if she hadn't made it, I would never have come here. And I can't—" She stopped. "I can't hold both of those things as true and still be angry at her. So I'm trying to let go of the anger." "Have you written to her? About what this has become?" "Not yet." "Write tomorrow," he said. "Tell her Thomas's care is handled. Tell her—" He paused. "Tell her whatever you want her to know. But tell her the anger part too if you need to. She should know what she asked you to carry." Emily looked at him. "You're very clear about things." "I've had 2 years of nothing to do but think," he said dryly. "You get clear." She almost laughed. "Is that what the isolation was for?" "Among other things." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. They were at the east corner of the fence where the land ran up toward the first rise of the granite ridge, and the sky above the ridge had the dense star scatter of high-elevation summer nights. Jacob said, "I was a different person before the accident." She said, "I know. Danny told me." "What did Danny tell you?" "That you used to laugh, that you made people want to work harder, that you were larger." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "I was also arrogant," he said. "Probably more than I knew. I thought the mountains were mine, that I understood them well enough that they'd keep the agreement." He looked at the ridge. "They didn't. And when I came back from that and couldn't do what I'd done, couldn't move. The way I'd moved couldn't track or climb or cover the ground I'd covered. I didn't know who I was without all of that." He paused. "So I decided I was nobody. It was easier than figuring out the alternative. And now," Emily said, the same question he'd asked her. He looked at her. "Now I think I was wrong about what I was made of. I thought it was the mountains and the tracking and the things I could do physically. And then someone came into my house and went through my father's files and wrote letters to federal investigators and told a Crenshaw to his face that the evidence was about to surface in a courtroom." He stopped. "And I watched that and thought that, whatever that is, that's what I want to be made of." Emily held very still. "You showed me what it looks like," he said, "to be useful with what you have. Not what you had, what you have." He held her gaze in the dark. "I've been trying to learn that." "You have learned it," she said. "You've been doing it for 6 weeks. You just haven't given yourself credit." "I'm working on that too." She said, "Jacob." "What?" "Stop talking for a moment." He stopped talking. She reached out and put her hand in his, the one that wasn't holding the cane, the one that was just his hand in the summer dark, and held it. Not dramatically, not as a declaration, just held it the way you hold something you intend to keep. He looked down at their hands, then up at her. He said very quietly, "Emily." "I know," she said. "Me too." His hand closed around hers. The letter to her mother took 3 drafts. The first draft was too careful. Everything organized and explained, every feeling managed into something presentable. Emily read it back and put it aside. The second draft went too far, the other direction. Everything she'd felt in the wagon on the way up from Millhaven, the cold of her mother's hand, the word difficult echoing in her skull. She read it back and put it aside too. The third draft was the true one. She wrote it early in the morning before Jacob was up, sitting at the kitchen table with Clara's early coffee and the first gray light coming through the window, and she wrote it the way she'd have spoken if her mother had been sitting across the table from her. She wrote, "I was angry. I need you to know that, because pretending I wasn't is a lie, and I've spent 6 weeks working for the truth, and I can't stop now. What you asked me to carry was heavy, and you knew it was heavy, and you asked me anyway. That hurt. She wrote, "Thomas is going to be all right. Jacob has arranged proper care. Not from the original payment. Something separate ongoing. You don't need to worry anymore." She wrote, "The man you sent me to is not what either of us expected. I don't think you expected anything good. I don't think I did either. We were both wrong." She wrote, "I am not disappearing here. I am more myself in this house than I have been in years. I want you to know that. I also want you to know that I forgive you, because I've watched what happens when people hold grievances and let them calcify into something that shapes every decision going forward, and I don't want that for either of us." She wrote, "Come visit when Thomas is well enough to travel. I want you to see this. I want you to see who I am here." She signed it, "Your daughter Emily. Emily Whitaker." She folded it and sealed it and set it by Pete's things for the morning run to town. Jacob found her at the table when he came in and saw the sealed letter and looked at her. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her and said, "How do you feel?" She thought about it. "Like I set something down that I'd been carrying so long I forgot it had weight." He nodded. "That's what honesty does." "Is that from experience?" "Recent experience," he said. "Very recent." He looked at her across the table with morning light between them and something easy in his face, something that hadn't been easy before, some chronic tension that had released. "Clara wants to make a proper breakfast." "Clara always wants to make a proper breakfast. I told her you'd help." "You told her without asking me." "I assumed," he said with the smallest possible smile. "I'm working on that too." Emily stood and went to the basin and started on the biscuits, and Clara appeared from the back hallway with the efficiency of a woman who had been listening for exactly this cue, and the kitchen filled with the sound of two women working, and Jacob's coffee cup on the table, and the ranch hands beginning to move in the yard outside. Danny knocked at the back door at 7:30. "Something for you, ma'am. Came with this morning's post." He handed her a letter. She looked at the return address. Millhaven, her mother's handwriting. She set it on the counter and looked at it for a moment. Clara glanced at it, glanced at Emily, said nothing, and went back to the biscuits with the particular tact of a woman who understood that some things needed to be opened in private. Emily opened it at the kitchen counter while the biscuits went into the oven. Her mother had written 3 weeks ago, the timing of the mail in the territories being what it was. The letter had crossed with Emily's own. She'd written before knowing about Crenshaw or Henderson or any of it. She'd written as far as she knew to check on the practical terms of the arrangement. But at the very end of a letter about Thomas's symptoms and the doctor's latest visit and the state of the shop and the neighbors and all the ordinary news of Millhaven, her mother had written, "I think about you every day. I know what I asked. I knew it when I asked it. I told myself it was the only way. And I still believe that was true. But I also know that true isn't the same as right, and I've been sitting with that difference for 6 weeks. I hope you are well. I hope he is decent to you. I hope Montana is at least beautiful even when it's hard. I hope one day you'll let me tell you I'm sorry." Emily folded the letter. She stood at the kitchen counter with the smell of biscuits beginning, and Clara humming something low, and Jacob's coffee cup on the table, and Thomas's photograph in her room down the hall, and she thought, "I already have." Gang. 3 months later, a federal grand jury in Helena indicted Gerald Crenshaw on 11 counts of land fraud and conspiracy. Henderson was indicted on 14 counts, including the Dean property, which he had taken under his own name from a widow who had done nothing wrong except trust the county official who came to her door. The bank president in Millhaven entered a plea agreement and returned the proceeds of 6 years of information selling to the federal treasury. The Helena land speculator, the man with the city accent Clara had described at her kitchen table, was arrested in October and did not make bail. Clara Holt got her farm back in November. She stood in front of the county deed office with the corrected document in her hands and Deputy Hal Carver beside her, and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "I'm going to need a good fence man." Carver said, "I know a ranch." The restitution process for the other families moved through the federal court slowly. the way justice moves, when it moves at all, imperfectly, incompletely, with delays that cost people things they couldn't get back. But it moved. Emily tracked every case in a separate ledger she kept in the study, and every time a name came off the pending list and into the resolved column, she marked it and went on to the next one. Thomas came to Whitaker Ranch in December, pale and thin, and still catching his breath on the stairs, but catching it his lungs better than they'd been in 3 years. He stood in the yard, looking at the granite ridge with the particular expression of an 8-year-old encountering something larger than himself, and not yet sure how to be the right size for it. Jacob crouched beside him awkwardly painfully, with the cane braced, and all the engineering of a man who has made peace with what his body can and cannot do, and said, "You want to see the horses?" Thomas looked at him with wide, solemn eyes. "All of them. All 6. Danny says there are 7. Jacob looked up at Emily with an expression of mild exasperation that made her press her lips together against a smile. "Danny," he said, "talks too much." 7 horses, Thomas said firmly. 7 horses, Jacob confirmed. He straightened up, and Thomas walked beside him toward the barn, the boy's short stride and the man's careful, deliberate one finding without negotiation a pace that worked for both of them. Emily stood in the yard and watched them go, and felt something so complete it didn't have a name and didn't need one. Her mother arrived 2 weeks later. She stood at the ranch gate with her bag and looked at Emily for a long moment, the way you look at someone when you've been carrying guilt long enough that seeing them in person arrives like a verdict. Emily walked to the gate and opened it and said, "Come in, Clara's made supper." Her mother said, "Emily, I know," Emily said. "Come inside." They went in together. That evening at the table, Jacob and Emily Thomas with color finally in his face, Clara with her coffee. Emily's mother, with her hands wrapped around a cup she kept lifting and setting down. Without drinking, Danny appeared at the back door for the last time that day and looked around the full kitchen with the wide-eyed expression of a young man who had arrived at a scene larger than he expected. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't realize I'll come back." "Sit down, Danny," Jacob said. Danny sat down. He looked around the table. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Emily's mother. He looked at Emily, then at Jacob, then back at Emily, with an expression of transparent delight that he was making absolutely no effort to contain. "This is something," he said. "Stop talking," Jacob said. "Yes, sir," Danny said, and grinned. Jacob looked at Emily across the table. She looked at him. Her mother was watching both of them with the eyes of a woman who had sent her daughter into the mountains, expecting loss, and was now revising everything she'd expected, piece by careful piece. Jacob said to Emily's mother quietly and directly, "Your daughter saved 17 families in this valley. You should know that. Whatever happened between all of us, you should know what she is." Emily's mother looked at him, then at Emily. Her eyes were bright in the lamplight. Emily held her mother's gaze and did not look away. Some debts could not be repaid, and some wounds could not be unfelt. But the table was full, and Thomas was breathing freely, and Clara had her land back, and justice, slow and imperfect and real, was moving through the federal courts toward 17 families who had stopped believing it would ever come. And Jacob Whitaker Mountain, Cowboy man, the valley had written off, and the mountains had tried to break, reached across the table and covered Emily's hand with his own in front of her mother, in front of Danny, in front of everyone. No calculation, no management, no wall, and held it there in the lamplight, like a man who had finally, after 2 years of convincing himself he had nothing left worth offering, decided to stop arguing with the evidence. Emily turned her hand over and held his back. That was the whole of it. That was all of it. 2 people who had arrived at each other through loss and necessity and the slow accumulation of ordinary days, choosing freely, clearly, with full knowledge of everything it cost and everything it carried to stay. Some arrangements become something else entirely, and when they do, they become the only thing that was ever real.